So welcome to what turned out to be our Star Wars themed, marketing related GDPR and promotions presentation. It turns out all three of us are Star Wars fans. So if you're not a Star Wars fan, then many apologies, but there's quite a lot of Star Wars related messaging within. So please bear with us, not least of all, the next slide, which I was the scrolling. So we're going to be talking about basically GDPR, marketing and promotion. So Sarah and I are going to go through some general themes with an introduction at the beginning. So we'll introduce ourselves at the beginning, and then we'll go through various different themes. And then at the end, Richard is going to bring in his way of looking at a different way of marketing and how you can benefit from that as well. So let's start by just saying welcome. I'm Mark Gracie from Mark Gracie GDPR. We've got Sarah Phillips from Optima and Richard Mack from RT Promotions, and the three of us are hosting this afternoon's presentation. Very briefly, I provide GDPR related services. I provide support services to organisations and businesses so that they get the help that they need with privacy or their data protection compliance. And I do that through a range of different helpline subscriptions. Very quickly, over to you, Sarah.
So for those of you who don't know me, my business is Optima. I've been doing that for about 2.5 years. I started my journey, believe it or not, doing philosophy and politics with marketing at the University of Exeter. Spent my professional career in a variety of in-house marketing roles in technology and manufacturing businesses. During that time as well, I studied a professional diploma with the Chartered Institute of Marketing and have a full membership for that. So yeah, like I said, the business started in November 2017, and I recruited my first member of staff, who I believe some of you know, the lovely Tesh, in January 2019. And as an outsourced marketer, my approach is very person-centric. It's very much about the customer. And that's partly due to my experience with my university studies and a lot of discussions and getting to the nitty-gritty of lots of complex topics. Product management as well, which I took on in those manufacturing businesses, employee motivation, and of course, marketing.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Mack.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Richard. My business is RT Promotions. A little about me is I did all the corporate stuff and was running sales teams in those businesses. FMCG is fast-moving consumer goods. So yeah, that was my core background, and then moved into sales and marketing as I moved into the security sector. So with big brands like ADT, Securicor and others. Got bored of all that, hear that story so often now, and I launched this company on the back of a fag packet really, with my primary goal was just to have a little bit of an easier life and to enjoy my journey. And I did that in 2004. And it sort of took off really. We punch above our weight. We compete with some big heavyweights in our industry and have some really sexy big brand clients. But I'm just still as passionate about working with small startup businesses. Doesn't matter to any of us, any of the team. We just want people to have effective promotional workwear or gifts. That's me.
Great, thanks. Right, okay. So let's start by setting the scene. So the theme of today's webinar is about GDPR. Is it a mark? I put a question mark on that because I had charge of the slides, and I thought, is it really a marketer's menace? I'm not convinced, but it's there to make everybody's life easier. But maybe if you're a marketing person, it may not be. But anyway, so let's kick off by doing my exciting favorite subject, GDPR. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. You need a whole a whole webinar just dedicated to GDPR to cover it in detail. But I very often use this slide as a summary of the key aspects of data protection. And when it comes to marketing, there's obviously a marketing slant to various elements of this. So just to clarify then, in that case, when we talk about data protection, we're talking about any data or the protection of any data that identifies an individual, either directly or indirectly. So if you've got an email address that is info@company.com, that's not personal data in itself. But if you had mark.gracie@info.com, then that would be personal data, because you're identifying Mark Gracie at the organisation info.com. The important thing to bear in mind is that business employees' data is that is personal data as well. So if you can identify an individual employee within a business, that's still personal data, and data protection applies. It's not just about consumer data. There are a set of rules which are called data protection principles. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you know, people tend to think about the concepts of retention and security particularly, and the GDPR introduced a new principle of accountability, which is about you proving that you are GDPR compliant and having documentary evidence of that. If you are processing personal data, that's law. You have to have a lawful basis. So if you've got data for a specific purpose, you have to be sure you understand that there's a lawful reason for you to be doing that processing. And in marketing terms, we tend to think a lot about consent as being the lawful basis for processing. And GDPR introduced some new tests and checks to make sure that people were actually giving the consent that they thought they were giving. So consent has to be open and transparent, and somebody has to take a positive action to give you that consent. And as you'll find out when we get onto one of the next sections, consent isn't the be all and end all, but when there is marketing involved, there are some rules around marketing that require you to have consent, and therefore that's why one of the reasons why consent is quite popular in terms of, or being the one that most people hear about. Individuals, data subjects, whether they're an email subscriber, somebody who you've got as a customer, a prospect, or whoever, they are all data subjects because you're talking about their personal data, and all of those data subjects have individual rights. One of the most important one is the right to be informed, which is the reason why we all have to have privacy policies that set out exactly how we process data and what we're going to be doing with it. And then I touched on accountability, just moving around that slide clockwise. There are various elements of GDPR that reflect on the accountability principle, which is about documentary evidence proving that what you're doing is compliant. It's taking due diligence checks on your processes if you use a third party to do the processing, and making sure there's contracts in place. And there's various other things. You might have heard data protection impact assessments, for example, which is a way of risk managing your data processing obligations. So there's a ton of things that relates to GDPR. When it comes to marketing, there are elements which are reflected in marketing, but we'll talk about how marketing and GDPR relate to each other in a few moments. I'm going to hand over now to Sarah for her part of this section.
So when it comes to marketing, there are certain aspects of data that are particularly important that we care about. To a certain extent, there is an element of marketing and employee engagement, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to focus on external marketing, so to customers. So again, that still covers personal data, so names, email addresses, direct phone numbers, so DDI, internal phone numbers, and mobile phones. But there's also lots of other aspects of customer data that people don't necessarily consider as being important to consider when they're processing. So images, for example, if you have images of yourself with clients in their workspace, is there any information that's on display? I mean, actually, even with you and all your little windows, do you have anything on the background with customer data on it? There's certainly more considerations than just the written word. Case studies and testimonials. So if you have been given some great feedback from a client around getting their permission to publish it. Copyrights and trademarks, there may be some particular rules that your clients have about sharing those and how you use them. And finally, your customers' customers. So if you are somebody like me, for example, who works with businesses that work with other businesses and customers and clients, how you use their examples as your case studies will also be affected. So you need to take into consideration all of these aspects before jumping in with your marketing activities with using these assets. So in terms of how we use data as marketers, and I say as marketers, a lot of small business owners are still responsible for marketing within that business. So a lot of you, for example, are business owners, and you will handle the marketing within your business. And whilst GDPR covers a lot of what you do, there are certainly these considerations along those specific lines. So in terms of managing data, I have to consider storage, access, the ability for them to opt out, and how it's managed. So I'm going to talk in more detail about CRMs later. Collecting data, and the three key areas that we'll be considering is direct consent, indirect consent, and third party. And then in terms of using the data, there are four key areas which for the purpose of this I'm going to discuss, which will be telephone, email, post, which again covers Richard's domain, and social media. Okay, Mark?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Okay, so the first sort of chapter in our Star Wars themed look at GDPR and marketing activity is the workforce awakens. So we're obviously all living in a new normal, and if anybody's watching me, I'll put new normal in quotes because that means different things to different people, and some people think it's a bit cheesy, but there is so much going on at the moment where data protection has implications for what you might be doing under this new normal, whether it's bringing your staff back to work, whether it's managing what your staff are doing when they're working from home, that I thought it'd be useful to sort of cover off this, and there is also a marketing angle to this. I think the biggest surprise to me, and I've stopped hearing it, but there were people saying, actually, do you know what, this is difficult for everybody. Let's dump data protection, let's dump the privacy regulations which determine when you can and can't send out unsolicited email, and let's just make the most of what it is. If we get into trouble, we get into trouble. Because in a lot of people's eyes, the Information Commissioner, who is the regulator in the UK who enforces GDPR and privacy regulations and some other elements of data-related regulation, don't seem to be doing much. Now, that's typically because the media only report the big stories. So you will have heard about British Airways last year. They still haven't fined British Airways, but they just announced that they were intending to fine them 183 million. And that is still outstanding. They've delayed it, and they're delaying it now. And then, of course, there's a whole issue around at the moment about whether the aviation industry is going to survive this current pandemic and the financial crisis that is looking like it's going to ensue. So is it right for them to fine BA 183 million still for an infringement which related to the security of a website? So there's a whole host of data protection related things to the way that we're having to live right now. And I just wanted to say, well, I've got a slide there that kind of summarizes the key areas. You're going to be needing to think about how you're protecting personal data, whether that's marketing data, client data, employee data, or whatever, in whatever is now your new office. There's a lot of businesses that are thinking actually working from home or having employees working from home is a more efficient way and cost-effective way moving forward. They're looking to adapt their business according to that. There's a lot of people who have been thrust into having to have their employees working from home. And there's more businesses are increasingly looking at actually how do they get their employees back to the office. And all of these things, data and security of that data particularly, need to be controlled and or understood so that you can manage those risks. And one of the risks is the human element of things. And if you talk to cybersecurity people, they will always talk about that human factor. Doesn't matter how much you get policy and process in place. Somebody might just accidentally do something which it ends up being a data breach. So that means you also have to instill in your employees the reminder about GDPR and what they should be doing, particularly with them working from home. And when we're talking about employees, you should also think about what you're doing with any employees that may be telling you that they've gone into isolation because they've tested positive, or at the moment I'm talking to quite a few organisations who are asking me about, is it lawful for them to record temperatures of employees as they come into work, with the concept of spotting anybody who might have a fever as being one of the symptoms of coronavirus. Well, any data that relates to health, even if it's a temperature, is a special category data, and that means that you have to have not only a lawful basis for having the data in the first place and doing something with it, but you also have to make sure that it's lawful for you to be doing that, because it's this extra special protection of this special category of data. So it's not just a case of, well, you know, we need to be COVID secure in our workplace, and therefore we'll test everybody coming in and we'll write down their temperatures and keep that data, and then we'll be able to analyze how people are changing, all that thing. It's much more complex than that. And just a very quick plug, I'm running a webinar just on that particular subject in a couple of weeks. We've all jumped on Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Skype, and we're all using video conferencing in a lot of different ways. Zoom is the most popular, got a real bad press at the beginning of the lockdown, because in the past it's had security issues, which they fixed. There's some other elements. People were worried that some of their servers are based in China, and does that mean the Chinese government have access to recordings? How do you know what the host is doing? And you will have noted that I pointed out I'm recording the session, and that it will only be the presentation bit that will be shared. We are not, you know, we're not going to be distributing a list and then tagging everybody to say that they were in there as well. So we've got our own little ecosystem of controls around how we're using Zoom, and everybody has to think about that. Yes, there are security elements, but there's security elements in most platforms. It's about using something that you feel comfortable with, that you're happy is compliant, and making sure your fellow attendees understand the risks as well. Like, you do know that people that are on using Zoom can also see you if you've got your video turned on, that kind of thing. A lot of businesses are taking their business online and doing things in different ways, and there's a whole host of checks and balances that ought to be looked at to see where data might be being stored that's not normally stored. Is the website secure enough, and so forth. The employees coming back to work, I sort of combine those two with the special category thing and that already. So there's some free resources on my website if you want to have a look at some of those in more detail, but more than happy to have a chat if anybody's got any concerns in that particular area. So from a marketing point of view, the new normal hasn't changed, provided you're not in that mindset of thinking, well, you know, we need to do what we can to survive here. Don't be tricked into thinking that you're not going to get caught out by the ICO, because the ICO are still working, and marketing compliance is still important. On a perhaps a more positive note, I'll now hand you over to Sarah, who's going to talk, I think, about CRMs.
Mark?
I'll just raise the question that Carol's put in the chat, if you can see that.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so those taking screenshots from Zoom, etc., and then sharing on LinkedIn, are they in breach of GDPR, as lots are doing that without permission? Well, strictly speaking, this is a real tricky area, because photographs of individuals aren't necessarily personal data, depending on how that information is going to be used. So strictly speaking, if I was to take a screenshot of Richard and Sarah and put it on Facebook and or LinkedIn or wherever, and tag them in those images, I am identifying them and therefore processing personal data. There is a general perception in data protection terms about people not being surprised, but yeah, strictly speaking, yeah, well, yes, I agree that, sorry, Carol's just updating the chat, names are written underneath them, which would therefore identify them. It depends on the context. People shouldn't be doing it, but it's no different than, I guess, going onto LinkedIn and saying it was great meeting Sarah at a networking event the other day, and sort of tagging them there, and then they can go to their profile and see their picture. So I think that, strictly speaking, there's possibly an element of breach of GDPR in that regard, but actually in practice, I suspect it's, you know, it's common practice. But somebody has a right to say, I don't want you to tag me in that image, and therefore please remove me from that picture, and you would have to comply with that as a GDPR individual right.
Great. Hi.
Okay.
Carol, we hope that's helped. I think it was a very comprehensive answer, slightly woolly, but
yeah, well,
that's where a lot of application of these things comes from, doesn't it? Yeah.
My favourite GDPR response is it depends, because a lot of it does depend on the circumstances. So a photo of an individual is not personal data unless somebody processes it for the purpose of identifying the individual, and then that's where it gets slightly complicated.
Right, so CRMs. For anyone who doesn't understand the acronym, I know Julie does because she heard me talk about it previously. Not that I'm supposed to say that. So a CRM is a customer relationship management system. It's an online Rolodex, if your career experience goes back that far. So lots of different people store their customer data in lots of different ways. I have heard stacks of notebooks, Rolodex, Excel spreadsheets, you name it. There's lots of different ways of doing it, but I, particularly in the context of GDPR, where Mark can hear me, I completely advocate using a customer relationship management system. And this doesn't necessarily need to be a painful thing to manage. And actually, there are a huge number of benefits from a marketing perspective to having one. And I've just listed some of them out here. So first of all, again, on the GDPR front, how you store and process your data is much more clearly managed when you have, most of them are cloud-based, digital customer relationship management system. You can also add additional security features like two-step verification. And when it comes to opting out, the way your customers interact with you, that most of the time that will feed straight back into your CRM and automatically opt them out of your communications. So it's just a really useful way of closing the loop in terms of compliance and security. Visibility and tracking. So it enables you to follow engagements with your contacts, track the email correspondence that you've had with them and any other conversations over telephone, any meetings, and also your orders. You can store your order systems in your CRM as well. So you can see when was the last time they ordered product X. If you're doing a special promotion on product Y, you can see that they've ordered that before and let them know. And the third point, inbuilt marketing. So OneNote. Ooh. I've never heard of OneNote being used as a CRM. That's quite interesting. Sorry, I'm jumping back to the chat. So inbuilt marketing as well, that's another hugely beneficial feature, why we need to see CRMs as a positive and not a negative. So some of them do email marketing built in, and it's for free. So you can have things like web forms and email marketing within your CRM, and you can manage it all in one place. Customer service as well, so you can view your history and your pipeline. So if someone calls you and said they've had a particular challenge with something and they can't quite tell you what it is, you can see what the last thing they ordered with and know exactly what they're talking about without having to drag it all up. And also being able to just touch base with them, say a week after you've had your last conversation, just checking in and seeing how things are going since your last contact. Integration. So these CRMs here, pretty much all of them will integrate with a separate email marketing platform like MailChimp or Communicator. And that's really powerful because it allows you to keep in touch with your customers on a regular basis in this new digital world where we're all living our lives online. And then being able to follow those interactions and see, who's opening your emails, having them automatically opt out from the emails rather than having to use two different systems. And it just makes everything much quicker and more powerful. Organization and time management. So I have a client who uses hers to manage her workload. She has a to-do list in there. And because she can link it to customers, if it's specific projects that are related to specific people, again, it's all there in one place. And it just saves the possibility of things getting lost or misplaced or accidentally ending up where they shouldn't. The seventh point is accessibility. So I use HubSpot, for example, and there's a great mobile app, so I can take it with me on my phone, scan business cards when I'm out at meetings. I don't have to carry around all those different bits of customer data in different places. The web interface is great, so you can use it on a tablet, and it just makes everything more convenient, being able to access all your data in one place without misplacing it. And then finally, capacity. So it's scalable and searchable, and there's no need to flick through the Rolodex to find something. You don't have to take that time. Most of them have really powerful search engines, so you can just type in LAU, and all the LAWers will come up, and you can instantly jump into your LAWA record and see last time you spoke. I'm just going to have a look at the questions. Is it easy to migrate data from one CRM to the other? Yeah, so most of them will allow you to export in CSV or Excel formats. And when you're going into the new system, they generally provide you with templates with the correct headers on, so your imported data fits. So really it's about doing that process of, that's probably the smoothest way of doing it, because they don't always match up their titles, for example. Does anyone have any further questions? I don't know how far up to read.
No, that was it. I think James was making a point that you can usefully schedule future follow-ups for a specific date or X days later.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of that doesn't even have to be done manually. So I have a web form on page of my website, for example, with a download, and that goes straight into my CRM. And so many days later, there's a follow-up email that says, did you have a chance to read it yet? What did you think? And I think actually a few people on the call have been through that process. So yeah, when you are a business owner doing, you know, your bookkeeping, your selling and everything else, the more you can automate and the less room for error, the better. And the CRM is the perfect way of doing that. And I'll just add those three there. I use HubSpot, I have used Capsule, and I hear Zoho is highly recommended. They all have free versions. So it doesn't have to be an expensive exercise either. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Sarah. So you've got your data, you're managing it using your favorite CRM, and obviously you've carried out all your GDPR checks and balances to make sure that as processors they're compliant. Let's talk about some of the messaging angles. So I'm going to just talk about what the rules are with regards to messaging and what is and isn't allowed. And there's a general misconception around the time that GDPR came in that GDPR replaced everything, and people missed that there's actually in the UK a regulation called the Privacy Electronic Communication Regulations from 2003, which implements the European e-privacy directive. And it's actually that directive or that regulation that we've got in the UK which determines when you're doing direct marketing, so that's sending targeted messaging to individuals, what the rules are, whether you do or don't need consent, what you can and can't do, and the such like. And so when we talk about marketing compliance, on the one side you've got data protection, which is the regulations which control what you can and can't do with your marketing data. So you need to abide by the lawful basis, the principles, the individual's rights and so forth, and the accountability as we said from the outset. But there's also these privacy or the PECA rules, the Privacy Electronic Communication Regulations, which sit alongside. So if anybody says to you, I thought that GDPR was going to solve spam and unsolicited messaging, they've not understood that actually that is not anything to do with GDPR. That's what the privacy rules say. Now, in terms of what the privacy rules say in detail, I've summarized them here, and there's a link at the bottom there, and you can download an infographic that summarized them as well. So the direct marketing rules are set out by the Privacy Electronic Communication Regulations, set out the conditions by when you can and can't market, and it covers electronic marketing, which from a regulation that is still dated in the sense that it's from 2003, includes phone, email, and associated texting messages. So that's things like sending SMS texts on mobile devices, messaging using social media, yeah, somebody just pointed out the majority of spam comes from cyber criminals, and as they're criminals, they by definition do not care. And yes, you're not wrong with that. But there's still a lot of businesses that misunderstand what they can and can't do as well. So messaging in general terms is emails, text, messaging using social media and so forth. But it also covers fax machines. So if you use faxes for sending marketing messages, you need to pay attention to these regulations as well. And you might be scoffing. People do still use fax machines, and I know from having to deal with people complaining about them that for customers that people do use faxes, or did used to use faxes for marketing purposes. Now, there's a set of rules around what you can do with phone calls. most people, and we, you know, for simplicity and due to the lack of time to go into the detail, I'll just talk about email and associated text messaging services and what are the rules there. So the rules are very clear. If you're dealing with consumers, you must have GDPR compliant consent. So that means that your consent messaging has to be that they have opted in because they fully understood what it is that you are going to be marketing to them. There is a slight confusion in that the privacy rules allow a slightly different approach when you're dealing with consumers, at least for customers. So if you want to market to your customers, you can do so, provided at the time that you sign them up, they were given the opportunity to opt out, and you wouldn't need to have consent in that regard. But if you're targeting people that you don't know, you will need consent, and that has to be now GDPR level of consent. And just to clarify, you can't email somebody to say, will you consent to me sending you email marketing, because that email asking for the permission or the consent is considered marketing in itself. So you can't ask for, if you haven't got consent to market, you can't ask for the consent in the first place. If you're dealing with businesses, sole traders are treated like individuals and consumers, so you can't market to sole traders in business unless they have opted in. But if you're dealing with other types of businesses, so limited PLCs and the such like, then you don't need consent. And I've seen lots of people saying that, why am I getting marketing from businesses? Don't they know GDPR is supposed to stop this? So it goes back to my previous point that GDPR hasn't stopped this. This is the privacy rules, but the privacy rules actually say for B2B marketing, provided they're not sole traders, you don't need consent. So if you wanted to scrape managing director email addresses off of LinkedIn or off of websites or any other kind of business directory or whatever, lots of people use Companies House, for example, to identify individuals, then you can do. But I would just add a caveat that because there's a lot of people out there who think that you need consent for everything, there's a lot of people who are actually questioning businesses that do that, even though they're allowed to. And I've worked with organisations who have had to put a process in because those people are disputing that they should be contacting them, and they ask them where they got the data from, and that becomes a subject access request. So it's about understanding when you do or don't need consent. The other aspect, and it doesn't matter what kind of marketing you're doing through which medium, you have to want to opt out. So you have to provide the function for somebody to easily opt out of your marketing, and you have to honour that. So don't think because somebody really will be interested in your marketing and you know better that that's okay if they've withdrawn consent. So you have to provide a mechanism for them to do it, and you have to honour it, and you can't go against that opt out unless they've changed their mind. So that's all I wanted to say on that slide. The key point from me was the consent rules, but I've just seen that some questions have come up. I don't know if they're all relating to me. Oh yes, there are. So hang on.
Lynn has asked if you're running a B2C campaign and invite people to refer a friend. Is that okay?
That's an excellent question. So if you provided you're running a campaign to people who the C part of that relationship are people who have opted in, then you can encourage other people to tell their friends about it. Yes, you have to be very careful how you do that, but yeah, I don't see any reason why you can't do that. So there's another question about, I've worked with a mystery shopping company and I phoned pretending to be a customer, and the person at the other end obviously doesn't know that it has been asked by the company to be done. Not quite sure what the question is there. So if you're acting on behalf of another organisation, that organisation is the one that has to take responsibility for the data protection compliance. The fact that you're a third party using their data to call up these people would actually make you a data processor, and they should be making sure you're GDPR compliant, and there's some other obligations under GDPR. But certainly if you're ringing somebody on a mystery shopping expedition, then you need to abide by the rules relating to phone calls, and they vary depending on whether you're dealing with live. Well, if you're ringing people, it'd be a live call as opposed to a recorded call, but the responsibility actually lies with your customer. Yeah, so Justin's pointing out that there, I haven't included that to over confuse matters, but yes, there was additional regulation that came in a couple of years ago for consumer protection, particularly around things around claims management services and pension schemes, and there are specific consent requirements around that as well. So yes, Justin, yeah, you're absolutely right with that. And another question to the B2C clarity: if your consenting consumer sends you their friend's email address, I'm guessing you can't then send them any marketing. Correct. The friend would have to opt into the marketing so that you can contact them. So that's GDPR and marketing consent in a nutshell. If you've got any more questions on that, we can pick those up at the Q&A in the end. But let's move on to Sarah and her sensitive data collection.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. I think this comes back to our title, really, GDPR, the Marketer's Menace, because the way I see it, and probably the reason why Mark has brought me onto this call, is GDPR forces us to do things that we should already be doing. So behaving in a way that is responsible and sensitive to the needs of our customers. So there's been a shift in marketing for quite a while that's been happening, and you'll see the scale on the bottom from push to pull. Excuse me? Yes. The transition is from push to pull. So push marketing is very much about interruption. It's about getting in your face. Advertising is a really obvious example of push marketing. It's interrupting your daily routine to provide you with the message. Whereas pull, on the other hand, is more about the customer looking for the solution and you being present. So I talk about presence a lot with my customers and making sure you're not necessarily trying to get in your customers' faces, but it's really easy for them to find you. So in terms of direct consent, this is most easily associated with pull marketing. You've got your current customers who are clearly very engaged with your brand already because they're already buying from you. And Mark's already said that when they began their interaction, they do still need to opt into marketing communications. But that's something that you can quite easily do with order forms, that initial relationship building. If you build it in, you'll know you have that there and you've got the opportunity to nurture and grow those loyal customers. And then there are two types of lead generation. And at the moment, offline is probably not so important, but that covers things like exhibitions, networking, the types of events when people are going to hand over their data for you. So if you go to a big trade show and you get scanned or you give someone your business card, that is direct consent. That's you saying, yes, you may contact me. And it's certainly worth still establishing what your intentions are. So on the digital side, that would be things like web forms, pay-per-click, webinars, social media, any way where they're engaging with you and they have an opportunity to decide how that relationship is going to happen going forward. And I say that's collecting data most sensitively because you're putting the decision making with the customer. They can choose whether to opt in, and it's really explicit, and it makes them feel reassured. And then you've got this kind of woolly middle ground of indirect consent. And if anyone's ever heard of platforms like lead forensics and other built-in trackers in your website, and I mean beyond analytics, things that identify you by your IP address, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, is personal data.
It is, yeah.
There we go, yeah, good. And this even applies to things like cookies, which is why the glorious cookie rule came in and why we all know those lovely banners on our websites. So from my perspective, in order to do so responsibly, I would look at shifting as much indirect consent to direct consent. Because if users understand and they've engaged with you and they are demonstrating an interest in what you do, that relationship is already going to start from a better place. And then on the other end of the scale, you have push marketing. So the gathering data in this way will be from things like buying lists from data businesses. And if anyone knows any telemarketers in the area, like Your Lead Machine, businesses like that have really good relationships with these data companies. And it is always worth using recommendations, because it's your responsibility as well to make sure that the data that you've got hold of from them, not necessarily a legal responsibility, Mark, correct me, that's been collected in a responsible way.
Yep.
Associations as well, so membership databases from any associations that you might be with. If you have a franchise, someone like Julia, I don't know if you have access to that kind of data, but they will have their policies in place for how that was gathered and consent that can be passed on to other members. So chambers, for example, and they'll provide you with these lists and you'll have the ability to use them. And again, I would say it's all a loop, because even if you have that third-party data that you've gained and you haven't necessarily gathered direct consent from them to have it, and again, it will be business addresses most likely, moving them into the direct consent category is, to me, the most responsible way of managing their data. You know, you are making sure that relationship is reciprocal and you're not bombarding them with something that they're not prepared for, even if they don't need to consent. Right. There is a question, if you only use Google Analytics, do you need cookies? Well, Google Analytics does place a cookie. Fair, Mark?
Yeah, Google Analytics does place a cookie.
At least many.
So the ICO have been really unhelpful, because they produced last summer some cookie guidance and updated it to be in line with GDPR. And they basically say that if you use cookies that that aren't required for the purposes of the running of the website, so cookies that are essential, so i.e. the website won't work without them, like remembering that somebody's logged into a membership system or that they've put something in a basket, then you must get consent, and that consent has to be GDPR compliant. So the quick answer is yes, Google Analytics does put cookies on your site, and therefore you will need consent for using those cookies. But then the ICO then go on to say about the differentiation between cookies that you need consent for because they're privacy intrusive or they're non-privacy intrusive. So privacy intrusive ones are where you can identify an individual or their behaviors, and then says that they wouldn't probably enforce non-privacy intrusive cookies, which means that Google Analytics, which falls in the non-privacy intrusive element, because you don't know who individually, you just know that people are visiting your site. So it's then left to us to make up a decision. Do you want to run the risk that actually the ICO probably wouldn't enforce it? But again, we can pick that up afterwards if you've got some more questions on that. It's just to put it in perspective, I've run a whole hour and a half webinar about just on cookies and the cookie guidance. So it's quite a complex area, as is all things with GDPR.
Riveting.
Yes, and riveting, yeah.
Right, that was me. Over back to you, Mark.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, Justin's just saying Google Analytics must be turned off by default, and it can only be turned on with the absolute consent of implied, as Google gets so much more information than we do. Yes, well, actually, the ICO's guidance has used Google Analytics as an example of a non-privacy intrusive cookie. So you would have to explain that Google may be using it and that there are options for you to turn it off. But strictly speaking, I think what you definitely need consent, and that has to be GDPR compliant consent. But there's a lot of businesses out there that aren't doing that when it comes to non-privacy intrusive cookies, not least of all because it's so much easier just to say we use cookies, turn them off in your browser if you don't want to use them. But that goes against the grain of what the regulation's anticipating. There's also a new e-privacy regulation that is supposed to be tidying up the mess that became the cookie rules. So there's a possibility that the area might change. Okay, so moving along to our next section, we're going to look at the new scope, the new way of thinking, and there's a number of different elements that we've covered here. We sort of tried to find the balance between sort of my expertise, which is around the rules and regulations, and Sarah's with regards to marketing and the best ways of doing that and doing ways that are engaging to individuals. So what I'm going to move on to now is to look at actually what the current climate looks like and answer a very specific question that I was actually asked about. Well, what do you do when you're, say, doing marketing or wanting to process data for people who are now working from home rather than their than working in the office. And the simple answer, and I caveat this by simple, I mean it's not that simple because you've got to think about it. The simple answer is that you have to identify a lawful basis. So you'll remember that I talked about lawful basis very briefly in my introduction about GDPR as in general. This slide shows what the lawful bases for processing are. Everybody knows about consent, and it's come up quite a lot in the talk so far. There's contract, which is you need the data to process the data for the purposes of delivering on a contract or entering into a contract. So it doesn't need to be a physical signed piece of paper contract. It can be delivering a service. So you don't have to have a contract, and it doesn't have to be a transactional engagement that involves an exchange of money or anything like that. If you're processing it because the law tells you you've got to do it, then that's legal obligation. And then there's a couple of others, vital interests and public tasks, which have very specific obligations. Public tasks is for people operating as public bodies, and vital interest is when the data subject has no capability of being able to determine whether they want their data to be processed, and somebody believes it's in their vital interest in a life and death scenario to have it processed. And then another favourite sort of, I guess if you were to have your favourite lawful basis, I think legitimate interest would either be number one or number two, because on the face of it, legitimate interest sounds like you can basically ignore everything else and just say, I've got a legitimate reason to be doing the processing of this data. But it's not that simple. You've got to be able to demonstrate that it's absolutely necessary, that you have a reason to do it, and that not being able to process the data would have, you can't process the data in it. You can't achieve the same aims by doing something else. You've got to process that data, and that is not harmful to the rights and freedoms of the data subject. So when we look at marketing, we tend to focus primarily on consent and legitimate interest, and they have very specific controls in data protection law. So if you're processing any kind of data, it doesn't matter why you've got that data, in the sense of you are collecting data for a very specific purpose. So that's one of the requirements, that's one of the principles of data protection, and you must only process that data for that specific purpose. If you want to use that data for a different purpose, then you've got to apply a lawful, so you've got to look at what the lawful basis is for processing that in a different way. So you might have, for example, one piece of data that you have that you've been given because somebody's given you that data for contract, but you might be obligated to keep that for 20 years because a law in your sector tells you to, which means that that element of retention is covered by legal obligation. And you've got to think about these lawful bases when you apply them to what data you're processing. So in any situation or circumstantial processing data, you need to have a purpose, and you need to understand the lawful basis behind it. So if you're now finding, and I know I've had this conversation with Richard, and I don't know whether Richard's going to touch on it specifically, but Richard's going to come up in a second and talk through some of his angles on all of this. Is the question that actually, if somebody is sending you a marketing list for you to do some processing with, but that marketing list is now an employee's home address, is it okay to process it? Well, it will come back to the individual who collected the data, because they will have ultimate responsibility for it. Have they collected it lawfully? Are they sharing it with you in a lawful manner, and so forth? So I kind of saying, simply put, lawful basis is you have to choose one of these, but actually it's much more complicated than that. So whenever you think about the data, whether it's an employee, a customer, whether it's their home address or not, it will depend on the circumstances. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that you need to understand, does the employee expect to hear from you? Well, of course, if you're communicating with them as an employee that you've told to work from home, then that may be agreed that that's within the terms of the employment. But it will come down to the individual organisation that's collecting the data in the first place and determining how that might relate to a lawful basis. Is it consent? Does it need consent? Is it a legitimate interest? And just finally, lawful basis has a very sticky role when it comes to marketing, because everybody thought that consent was the be all and end all. And we were all probably flooded with sort of consent fatigue at the end, sort of middle of 2018, thanks to the May 2018 deadline for GDPR coming in, with people emailing us left, right and centre. Some of them not even knowing that they had our data in the first place, asking for consent to continue to process it. Some of it was done when they didn't need to. But everybody thinks about consent, but it's not necessarily consent is the be all and end all. And then there is a very unhelpful mention in one of the recitals of GDPR that says direct marketing may be a legitimate interest, but that doesn't bypass the fact that if the law says you need consent, you have to have consent. So you can't just say, well, the law says I need consent to market to consumers, but I have a legitimate reason to grow my business to consumers, therefore I'll just market to them anyway. So I sort of wanted to touch on lawful basis and how that fits into marketing within the context of the fact that you'll be possibly now under the new normal, as it were, this new scope of working, possibly processing data in a different way, and it's important that you understand what the lawful basis is for that processing. So let's move on to Sarah, who's going to talk about making the most of marketing channels.
So now that Mark's put the fear of God into you all,
Yeah, sorry about that.
The number of times I speak to new clients and they tell me their database got wiped out, 2 years ago when GDPR came in, because they just didn't get around to getting the opt-in. That doesn't mean you have to throw in the towel. And there's plenty of ways you can build and rebuild databases. And these three that I've pulled down, with the exception of lumpy mail, which is Richard's territory, are free. So this is all about having the time to rebuild your database, and it's completely worthwhile to do so, obviously, because that's your whole network of potential customers. So in terms of the telephone, checking in. It sounds really obvious, but especially at a time like this when we're no longer bumping into people or going for coffees, pick up the phone, call your current customers, see how they're doing. See if they, I meant to give you a call last week about this project I'm working on. I'm glad you rang. You'd be surprised how much just making that engagement can make a difference to your growth. Customer surveys as well. So even if you know there might not be any intention to buy at this point, checking in, maybe doing some market research about potential launch or what might you be interested in as an offer. I'm looking at my promotions for next month. And getting back in touch as well. So I'll come back to that one, Justin. So getting back in touch as well. So people who you may have worked with a year ago, who've gone a bit cold, it's always worth touching base with them as well. Giving referrals. So if you made a new business contact that you feel may be of benefit to one of your other customers or someone in your network, picking up the phone, giving them a ring and letting them know. And again, networking follow-up. Every network that we're in, the leaders are always telling us to do the follow-up. And it's amazing the number of people who don't. And if you've had that one-to-one conversation and you know there's potential there, don't forget to follow up after your networking. And all of these can be used as well as methods of building up your database, getting that legitimate interest and consent, and rebuilding or building a database. So in terms of email, there's plenty of things you can be emailing your customers about. So newsletters and updates on what you're doing in your business, any blogs that you've written, top tips, so something that's happened in the news that you think would be of interest to your customers, special offers, and again, surveys, equally as useful via email or the telephone. Physical mail, so you have newsletters, again, special offers if you've got a flyer with a code on it, and lumpy mail, which I will leave at that because that's Richard's territory. Social media is my quite strange icon that I put in there. So there's plenty of ways of generating and engaging with people with social media beyond posting. So you can pose polls and questions. You can respond to your engagement. So if someone's commented on my post, I could direct message them and say, thanks for commenting on my post. What did you find interesting about it? Start a conversation. You've potentially gained a new connection. Reciprocal engagement as well. So where people have interacted with you, to respond in kind. Always very much appreciated. And again, a good way of building that relationship. Direct messaging. So LinkedIn in-mails. That's a great method of speaking to someone that you don't already have a connection with. And they are available even in the free plan. I think you get 5 per month with the free. And then sponsored posts. So again, this is, I said this is free, this is another exception. So if a post is just doing particularly well, you can always give it a bit of a boost and push it beyond your network. I'd probably say, which I haven't put on the slide specifically, there are great relationships between these different platforms as well. So it's not just about, you know, making a phone call and then that being the basis of the relationship. One thing I encourage my customers to do is set up email landing pages for people to opt into newsletters. Even if you're not ready and you haven't got a system set up to do so, if you're posting a link out there saying, hey, if you're interested in what I'm doing, sign up for my newsletter, you can just leave that going and tick over and build up a database. You know, put that form on your website. And then you know you've got that direct opt-in consent from the beginning. Do we have any questions? How far back can you go when approaching past customers? This might be a Mark question.
Well, the quick answer is it depends. So it depends on the circumstances by which you have their data in the first place. And, you know, going back to what I said before and identifying that it's lawful for you to do the marketing. I suppose one way of looking at it, if you're scouring your computer and you think, oh, I've just found a pot of data of load of people's email addresses, I don't know where it's come from, I probably shouldn't have had it at all, then that's probably the time to delete that data and not use it for marketing purposes, even if they're past customers. If they're an existing customer in the sense you've got an ongoing relationship with them, then you can market to them, provided they haven't told you that they don't want to receive your marketing. So it might be that if you've never marketed to your customers using this soft opt-in approach, then you probably want to sort of preempt your first marketing message saying, I've decided I'm going to, you know, I thought you might be interested in this as an existing customer. But if you haven't been in contact with people who, you know, you have a one-off relationship and you've not spoken to them in 10 years, you could arguably say that that's fine, you can still contact them, because as long as they've not told you that they didn't want to receive any marketing from you. But it will depend on the circumstances and that relationship that you might have as to how they might react to you getting in touch with them afterwards. So yeah, so that's why it depends, and also why I guess the time involved might have a lot to do with it as well. And Justin's just sort of saying what when you said, Sarah, about people saying that they had their databases wiped out when soft opt-in could apply. I don't know if you've got particular views on that. I know I certainly have from a compliance perspective.
Well, from a practical perspective, a lot of them didn't understand, as Mark said earlier, the distinction between B2B contact data and B2C contact data. So they just automatically went, oh, bugger, and left it. But equally, there are a lot of, they've also had data that they haven't done business with, but they might be sort of a stack of cards that they've gathered. They don't really know where, but they didn't put them through the process 2 years ago. So they don't know where they've got it from. And like Mark says, if you can't trace that relationship back, then it's a very much choppy territory.
Yeah, and certainly one of the requirements, because of the changes in consent, were that if you weren't sure where your marketing data had come from, and you probably ought to have had consent, then you probably need to re-seek that consent. But there was a lot of people that were re-seeking consent that didn't need to, for exactly the reason Justin highlights, which is soft opt-in might have applied, and they lost their data, because if you ask somebody for their permission, it's very binary, yes or no, you're asking for consent. And if they haven't replied or they say no, that's it. The soft opt-in doesn't matter. Somebody has opted out, and you can't assume that because somebody didn't respond that they're still okay to receive it. And therefore people were finding their databases were wiped out because only 5% of their database bothered to reply and say, yes, I want to carry on receiving your marketing messages. So, and there's lots of reasons why they might not have got the message in the first place, like it's fallen in a junk box, or the email address was slightly wrong, or whatever.
Another question for you, I think, from Shane.
Yeah, could a sole trader add their personal details to MailChimp to email their contacts that they know personally? Well, the marketing rules will apply. If those contacts that you know personally are B2B, then yes, you can. If they're B2C, so they're consumers or sole traders, doesn't matter that you're a sole trader or not. If they are a sole trader or a consumer, then you can't start marketing to them without permission, according to the law, depending on how well you know them personally, you could argue that you're just doing a friend-to-friend contact. But you know, strictly speaking, from the law's perspective, you need consent if they are sole traders or consumers. So you couldn't just add people that you just happen to know or be able to guess what their email addresses were. So mail, you can mail them directly, provided they haven't told you that they don't want your mail. Assuming by mail you mean post.
Yeah, that's an important point. I have had customers who said, okay, well, I won't use an email marketing platform. I'll just send the message individually from my Outlook. That will be fine then.
The same rules apply.
Exactly. So yes, it's not necessarily the mechanism that you're using, it's the action and the intent that's important.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And all of this comes back to behaving in a responsible way. Would you feel comfortable if you were on the receiving end of these communications? I always tell my customers, I tell everyone actually, walk in your customer's shoes, think with your customer's perspective. You know, how would you want to be treated? How would you want your data to be processed? And I think if we've got any moral fibre about us, that should certainly align with what we're supposed to be doing with GDPR anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Okay, great. Right, we're going to hand over to Richard from RT Promotions, who's going to give us his perspective on it all. And I think lumpy mail is your area of specialty, Richard. So
Fund it.
Yeah.
For anyone who knows Richard, this is probably the longest he sat on a call without saying anything.
I've been sitting on my hands here. Very, very polite. Yeah, hi everybody, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Mark. Let's remind ourselves too that I'm going to look at this more positively and not worry too much about the legalities, because that's all been covered. So I'm going to assume that you've taken care of those things, that you do have permissions. And I'm going to remind you that with the workforce awakening and with the new scope, people are coming back. And my point is, how do we engage with our clients or potential clients? How do we do that without sounding cheesy? And how do we do that without being annoying? So just to keep it simple, I'm going to keep that to lumpy mail, things that can go in the post. And bear in mind then it splits into two patterns. It splits into, are you trying to reach out to people that are still at home? That's the new scope. People are now working from home. So that's a new area a new opportunity for me to get on the desk with a coffee coaster perhaps, or a coffee mug. So how would we go about that? How do you do that without being annoying and so on? And the other people are slowly coming back to work. So that's a whole different can of worms. So I'm going to explore with you just a few things and show you the good, the bad and the ugly of how to do those things, some things that are different. Because if you can make things different, you'll get a reaction that says, can I keep it? Can I have that? And the lumpy mail, of course, has got your brand on it. So the first thing to cover off is, if you're doing lumpy mail, think about costs, because you can see by the graphic there, if you're sending something out letter post, it's pretty cheap. But if you start to do anything remotely lumpy, even a pen in an envelope will not go letter mail. It becomes a small parcel. So let's just cover through what that could look like. The first thing I want to show you is a coffee mug. So coffee mugs are always really popular. They're great to send in the post. You could get breakages, but it's a great thing to send out to people, whether they're at home or anywhere else. Stick a Mars bar in there, put it in the post. It's going to put a smile on somebody's face, isn't it? Now, that mug you're looking at there has very simple graphics. Is that a mug? It's lovely. It's one of my clients, so I mustn't knock it. But is it a mug you'd keep? Is it the mug that you'd like? Or do you want to look at the next one where somebody's gone with a different colour mug and they've decided to go all black, and that very manly, very alpha male, and that's showing you the graphic running around that mug. Is that a mug you'd keep? Is that going to be one that stays on your desks? Having gone to all the costs of putting it in the post, are you going to keep it? And then you look at the next one, which has got an even more dynamic shape. You're heading into what I call the keeper market. Mugs like this, you aren't going to go to the back of the kitchen cupboard if you're at work, that is. They're going to be kept out because it's got a certain style to it. Or you could be cheeky. If you have a look at what this next client did, he put, with us, we put graphics on the bottom of the mugs so that while you're drinking, there was an animal's caricature face, which he thought would be very funny and entertaining. He didn't actually tell people that was on the bottom, so it is branded on the sides, but that was just them having a sense of humour. They were an IT web design company, and they thought that would be a cool way to do it. But let's just take this to the current stage. And we're working right now with clients, with people coming back to work where you've got self-distancing and mugs going in the kitchen. So the next idea is where we're personalizing individual mugs. So the other side of that mug has got their brand on it. And this one is a cheeky message where we're putting in every single member of staff gets their own mug. And that way, you know, it's pretty clear that that mug belongs to Kelly. You get the idea? Now that's not cheap to send out through the post. None of these things are. Mugs aren't the cheapest deal. Let me show you another thing, very, very popular is a notebook. They're very popular. That's a great way to welcome your staff back or to give to a client. That's an accountancy firm we work with. Their brand is yellow, mustardy yellow. They wanted that. But if you look at the next notebook I'm going to show you, we've done branding a little bit different. So they're still a yellow brand, and they were doing very loud notebooks. But here, they didn't know we could do things like this. That's a debossed. So it's been thumped with a metal's eye, and it leaves their logo behind it. It blew them away. Their clients loved it. The clients were used to these very loud notebooks. Now they've got something they're going to keep. Keep reminding yourself, you've got to say, do you want one? Is it something you'll keep? And hopefully, they'll start remembering your brand if you do so. The next one is something we did for Google. They actually did buy off of me, and they did that same technique. They put down a blind embossed or debossed effect on there. Not cheap. So let's look at other things that we can put together for you that could go through the post and reach your clients. This is a classic. It's an air freshener. Worked with many, many clients on these very successfully. They can be shaped. We've done love heart ones. This is ones for people that were promoting camper van conversions we did. And that was specifically to their shape. And you're appealing now to people's senses. Because, you know, there's probably 36 different smells we can put on there, or aromas. And that's a nice way to get into people's cars, rather than trying to get on their desks with your promotional activity. The next one is a well-known garden centre brand. They wanted to let people know that they were open for business and they were reopening. So these went out to people on their mailing list. A simple little sticky bug, a bumblebee. Would you throw that away? Would you really just discard that? Probably not. So quite a clever thing to do. Why, who's not going to like a little bumblebee? And it's making the message known. It went out with a flyer to tell people that they're open for business. So you see what we're doing here. This is about reaching people, putting a smile on their face, not just sending them a blind bit of merchandise. It's thinking about who your target market is. The next one's pretty cool. These are flat pack mobile phone stands. So it's a mini deck chair. It's flat packed, so it goes through pretty cheap, pretty low cost. We worked with a legal firm that did that. I don't think this is such a cool idea. If you look at the next slide, because it shows you where the branding goes, which means that when that is in use, if you put your phone there, you hide the branding. So for that reason, I don't think it's altogether that cool, but you know, it gets a reaction. So we work with a few legal firms on that, and you know, you'll never guess what it turned into. It turned into one of the local legal firms wanted real deck chairs. So they put an order in for us for just 3 deck chairs they wanted to use at their summer events and their summer parties that they were doing. That's a picture taken down at Christchurch Priory. Let's look at pens. Pens are great to put in the post. Colourful pens. Most people buy a pen because it's on brand, it's on their colour. Have you got that in my colour? And you'll keep it based on the colour quite often. That's nothing wrong with that. If you look at the next slide, that's with some standard branding going on there. It's got a little stylus thing in the top. It's a pretty low-cost looking pen. But that pen does something pretty special. So if you see the next slide, you'll see what that pen does. So just by clicking the stylus, it lights up your logo. It happens to be my logo on that pen, but it's a great way to get people to remember your brand. I worked with a client that was lighting up people's personalities, or lighting up their look. Put a light, make your face and your look pretty cool. That was effective. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of work with people that are coming back in the aesthetics market, people that are returning to work and they want to appeal to their clients that might be coming out of lockdown, and they're saying, look, we're open for business. Could be hairdressers, spa treatments, beauty, whatever's. I'm not too sure where that's going, so I'll stop. So yeah, you could do something like that, a little pocket mirror. They're very low cost. Let me show you what we're doing that's proving to be really, really effective. These are little cool packs that you put in the fridge, and then I think it's to do with having Botox treatments or lip fillers treatment. And people coming out of lockdown, they need to catch up with this because they haven't had their treatments in 2 or 3 months. So I'm seeing a rush of products like this at the moment. And there's one of the staff mucking around with one, showing you how you use them. So what they're doing is something really clever. That is reaching out to people that are in their client base with something that you'd keep because it's effective and efficient, but it's also reminding you that you're on the end of a phone call to book up a treatment anytime you want. Right, punching through the next ones. If you're looking at a low-cost thing to put in the post, you cannot go wrong with a trolley coin keyring. They're fairly low cost, they're pretty good, and it appeals to B2B markets and B2C markets, which is really tough. To get people to hit a product that will hit both markets is pretty tough. So that's one we did with the National Trust. The next one is the new pound coin shape that we've done with an engineering fit-out firm. But why don't you go a stage more? You know, yeah, these are fine. I don't want to knock it. I'm selling them. This one is beautiful. We did that with a top-of-the-range garage firm, and that's in like a horseshoe holder. It's magnetized, so the coin is just, it slides out of that. They're beautiful. And the next one is some work that we've done with Marks and Spencer. They've just put some orders in for us, and these are biodegradable. So they've moved away from the metal. There's still the pound coin. It does come on a key ring. I've not shown it here, and that's pretty clever. That's pretty cool, and that's a way of showing people that you care. Perfect for B2C markets. Something you can put in the post. Something you'd almost certainly keep. It's a keeper. Okay, moving on. I'm nearly through my sort of range. Coffee coasters, powerful way. It's really, I think of the coffee coaster as the poor relation to the coffee mug. Every coffee mug that's expensive needs to be put on a coffee coaster. But what this company did, they rather than just slap their logo on it, which is the piece in the middle, they've done that little sort of bullseye effect, which is promoting all the different channel streams that they've got. So it's appealing to all the different markets that they appeal to with their brand, with a telephone number, call me now. The next one, this is probably the most popular coffee coasters we're doing at the moment. It's completely shaped. That's been made to look like a tire. That's a recruitment company, but they were targeting the fulfillment industry, the logistics. So they wanted to reach out to those people to say, we can find you drivers, forklift truck drivers, lorry drivers, whatever. That is a massive keeper. You touch it and it's rubbery. As a direct result of that, that's one of my coasters. I went to see a new client. That's the next coaster. And they said, can you make one for us like one of our trucks? So that isn't a random truck. That is one of their trucks that they've put their brand on. They don't even have their brand on the truck. They just look after DAF trucks. But again, that's beautiful. It's shaped, it's specific. It will appeal to their target market, and it won't get thrown in the bin. Another very simple one, the next one we're showing you, shows some of those things in play. So a very simple little van for the white van man that we worked with a coffee mug. That's the kind of thing that you want to see going out on people's desks. One of those things is more expensive than the other. One of those things is more expensive to get out. But bringing the two things together, very clever marketing. Let's look at sweets. Sweets, really popular, color-coded. Who's not going to smile if you put some sweets in the post? On the other hand, why don't you put some mints in the post? So very popular are these things shaped like business cards. That will go letter post. No question, that will go letter post. Why don't you shape it like a house? So we can do them shaped like a little house that will knock out mints if you want them. Perfect for things that are people that are home-based. But there's no doubt about it, the absolute best example I've seen of getting mints into people's hands is the next one that we did with an IT company. So these are designed to look like headache tablets. And look what they're saying. They're just saying if your IT is causing you a problem, give us a call. Pop. So instead of giving away loads of mints, they just gave away 5. But it put a smile on people's face. I think that's so clever. And can you imagine how wafer thin that is to put in the post? That's a really standout marketing idea. And that to me is a good example of when you work with a really good design company. You don't just slap your logo on things and get it out there. You're working with me to come up with a clever idea, and you're working with a design company to come up with very, very clever artwork that does that. Love it. Final few things to show you is a great thing to send out at the moment are Post-it notes. So these are Post-it notes that I've done with people. Post-it notes are different sizes. So you've got a couple there. And then finally, if you really want to stand out with Post-it notes, look at this bad boy. So what you've got going on there, if you could click that again for me, Mark, what you've got going on here is sequential printing on a sticky note, really hard to do. And I've done that with a plane taking off for an airline. That's showing you a taxi firm. We've done it for a DHL as well, where it's showing you one of their vans driving along. So my point is, guys, I'm trying to show you, it doesn't have to be cheesy. These are things that you could go, wow, I want one, I want to keep it. And that's a perfect way to reach your audience during this time, getting your messages out there to say, look, we're open for business. When you're ready, please come and knock on our door because we're ready to do business with you. Now, I haven't caught up with any messages while I've been doing that. So are there any there for me?
Everyone's loving what you've presented.
Yeah.
Lots of compliments. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay.
So yeah, that was fantastic, Richard. Thanks very much for that. So we're hoping that the idea and the concept of this it was to combine compliance, so that's my area, with marketing, so that's Sarah's, with an alternative way of looking at how we can survive in these new times right now. And I think you can see from the stuff that Richard was presenting there that there are so many different options, and the stuff that Sarah's covered as well is fantastic in terms of ways that you can use marketing to inspire people when, I mean, let's be honest, everybody's really struggling. So if you're hearing, if you've heard what you've seen there, and you would like to know more or reach out to us to ask, ask about our services, or maybe got a quick question, then this slide's got our questions, and I'll leave that on there for a second. But we've reached the end. We've got about 5 o'clock until 5 minutes even till 4 o'clock. So there is some time for some questions. I think we managed to get through all the questions that were in the chat that were raised. But if anybody's got any questions, what I'll do is I'll move over from sharing the slides, stop sharing, and I'll stop the recording, and then we can go back to traditional Zoom display. And if there's anybody got any questions, we can try and pick those up. It might be, I'll see how we get on. I think there's enough for me to see everybody on one screen. So if you want to wave, then wave, and then we can try and do it. Depends how many people want to ask questions.
The main reason I would say I wanted to support Mark and Richard with this is that businesses needn't be afraid to reach out to their customers, and all you have to do is enlist the help of someone like Mark, who can just take away all the pain of the things that might be holding you back, the fear of getting it wrong. Because like Richard's shown us, there's so many wonderful, engaging ways of sharing your brand with potential customers, so we shouldn't be afraid to do so. But it's just in terms of closing the loop and bringing the two together, compliance with all these wonderful creative ideas, and being imaginative with it. And yeah, certainly if you don't have an imagination, Richard does, so he can certainly help you out with that.